heal your soul. If you want to talk to Soul, call 954-696-8330 and begin your steps to better health. Rain International also has job opportunities that can change your life in 7 different categories. Call today and get a healthy body, a healthy mind, and create a healthy bank account. 954-696-8330. Call today and let's make it rain.
Talk 1470 WWNN Pompano Beach, Boca Raton, Miami, Fort Lauderdale.
If you're sick and tired of being sick and tired, tune in to the Dr. Bob Martin Show. From erectile dysfunction to eczema, heartburn to headaches, carpal tunnel to how to lower cholesterol drug-free. Sunday mornings at 10 on Talk 1470 WNN.
If you suffer from excruciating back pain, do not have surgery. Call Dr. Fernando Ranella, MD, and ask him about the new ozone therapy and how it can eliminate your back pain once and for all. End your suffering today. Call Dr. Fernando Ranella, the Center for Back Pain Management, 561-819-6325. That's 561-819-6325 or injectpainaway.com.
Thank you for calling our program.
I just wanted to make a comment about how I have been working with your services for such a long time. I'm a subscriber now to the new Buy, Sell, and Hold newsletter, and I want to let you know, I mean, you hear all the talking heads, and you don't know which way the market's going to go. They don't use your cycles. As you know, I'm an investor that tries to stay and ride trends out one way or the other. And just the peace of mind knowing that you've got primary cycle and an investment cycle is so reassuring.
Buy, Sell, or Hold with Peter Bruno, weekdays at 4:30. The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. The content of the following program, including all statements from the hosts and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by the host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program shall not be viewed as substitute for a personal consultation with an attorney. Now, prepare yourself to be informed and entertained by Gus Bravo and Neil Kotze, 2 AV-rated trial lawyers who have been practicing law for a combined total of nearly 40 years. For the next 30 minutes, they will share their insight and commentary on important legal issues affecting all of us.
2 lawyers are sitting watching the recent Democratic presidential debate when Bernie Sanders, from the podium, says that global warming is one of the leading causes of terrorism. And one lawyer turns to the other and says, I don't know what's worse, the fact that he said it or the fact that no one in this audience is gasping. Welcome to Attorney Confidential. I'm Neil Kotze.
And I'm Gus Bravo. I thought they were Republican lawyers.
I think
this hypothetical situation.
And in some ways, I hesitated to even do a joke today in light of the recent events in Paris, which I think Gus and I are going to spend some time.
It was too quick of a segue. Actually, we were going to talk a little bit about the Bernie Sanders. But yeah, you're right. Look, we're going to do something a little different here today. We're going to actually talk about more substantive stuff and probably less humor. But I think it's important because in light of the tragic events in Paris over the weekend, I think it was Friday actually, and it just obviously these are one of those moments in one's life that you kind of like 9/11 and something similar to that. But I think it's important also to talk about in terms of the just general the law, politics. What now, right? I mean, I think everyone's quite the uniform thing has been a statement and a comment, right? That's horrible what happened. But how do we respond?
Exactly. And it's a tough decision. I mean, one of the issues now in the United States is what do we do with these refugees? And I know Gus and I have had a long discussion about that prior to coming to the show.
Well, there's point and counterpoint. Yeah. We've said it. We make no secret about it. You're a registered Republican, and I am a registered Democrat. One of us only. Well, Miami-Dade tends to be a little bit, 50-50. I think
it's kind of in the middle,
right? Whereas Broward is overwhelmingly Democrat, and Palm Beach County is kind of similar to Miami-Dade, a little bit more Republican. But we're not extreme. Obviously,
no, I mean we're probably closer to the middle than either end of the extreme,
right? And I think we have those, as particularly when it comes to immigration. We also have immigrant backgrounds. So your father is
My father is a Middle Eastern refugee. I mean, as we were talking about that, so that's an issue that hits close to my heart because obviously my father came here as a result of religious persecution and managed to make it to the United States from Egypt. And based on the concerns going on now, I'm not sure I would want, without protection and without proper screening, a lot of Middle Eastern...
You wouldn't let Dad in, is that what you're saying?
I may not let Dad in without... I think Dad would have passed the screening, whatever they did, but it's a tough call because...
My experience is even more direct because I came here, for the first 5 years that we were in this country, we were here illegally. We just overstayed our welcome, so to speak. We came in on a tourist visa. We didn't cross any border, and like we flew in from Chile on an airplane, and landed at MIA, and we had a visa, and we overstayed our welcome. And then, ironically enough, it was when a Republican president by the name of Ronald Reagan passed the amnesty in 1986. Which could you imagine if Reagan was one of the presidential candidates now and talking about amnesty? How far do you think he'll get with this current crowd? But so he passed the amnesty in 86, and that's how me and my family, I was 7 years old when I came to this country. My sister was 1. So that's how we were able to become legal citizens. Right. And we've become contributing citizens, obviously. And so the problem when you hear someone like Trump talking about sending everyone back, I mean, that's just beyond it being absurd and logical, it just doesn't make sense.
No, I mean, look, we can make Bernie Sanders jokes, and I think the Republican equivalent would be to make Donald Trump jokes.
I think he stands all on his own. But I think the bigger issue, because you mentioned earlier, is the Syrian refugee. Because now we have, I don't know how legitimate, but it is a legitimate concern that, how many of these, because I think one of the attackers pretended to be a refugee and got in through Greece and so forth. Exactly. And so, of course, naturally, people are going to say that let's not allow that to happen here. The problem is you're talking about one out of how many thousands and tens of thousands, and what people don't talk about enough, especially about these other 7 attackers. I believe all of them, if not most of them, were French nationals. Some of them born in Belgium.
That's the hardest part.
So it's from within. You can't just set up these borders. It's also there's an idea, and I think you and I were talking about earlier. Sure, they have to respond, right? The French, which is kind of interesting about the French thinking about being aggressive and going to war, but they bombed and everything.
Finally, I mean the French exactly. I mean this is the same government that wouldn't let Reagan fly over French airspace to bomb Libya, and so we accidentally bombed the French embassy when we attacked Libya. Who knows?
Yes.
I mean, I think Reagan called up the French president and said, we're sorry, we bombed your embassy. Our pilots were incredibly tired during the mission. Of course, they wouldn't have been so tired if they didn't have to fly halfway around Europe to get to Libya. But anyway.
Well, but I think the issue is it's not a simple answer.
No, it's not.
I mean, it's a very complicated answer. And I think it's not, it's not fighting. And I gave the analogy before. It's sort of like the war on drugs, right? It's not simply about ironically enough, the war we labeled in the 80s the war on drugs and how many tens of millions of billions of dollars we spent trying to fight that
drug czar, right?
Yes, and look where we're at.
No, I mean it's no better than
I mean I haven't seen anyone sit on a battleship saying mission accomplished for the war on drugs, but I'm sorry, I bring back memories. I know, but I think it's the idea, and that's an issue. I was talking to my buddy earlier, Mark, and he's very much into following all the debates and all this good stuff, and he's kind of like my sounding board sometimes when I talk politics. And he said, "This is an idea. It's not just simply about a bunch of extreme people or extreme religious views. There's an idea that's festering among a certain sect of the Muslim world. And so it is a touchy subject, but something we're going to have to confront head on, because you're talking about a very small minority of I mean, I don't know what the extremists would be, probably less than 0.1%, right, of the Muslim world. The problem is it's gaining a foothold amidst the European ghettos where a lot of the European Muslims live. And here in the U.S., I mean, we've seen attacks on our own military bases from, it's just the idea is festering because now with, I think, social media, with the technology, that you can have that propaganda. And the scariest thing is it was 8 people. You know what I mean?
Well, how many terrorists brought down the planes? 9/11. It wasn't much more than 8, was it? It was this 5 planes? So maybe 3 per plane, 15 thereabouts?
Right, thereabouts. I think it was in the teens.
Yeah.
It was in the teens. And that's what's scary is it doesn't take many people.
Not at all. I mean, you go back to World War II and the Japanese, the kamikaze pilots, when they hit the aircraft carriers, they were killing thousands of Americans. And that's just one pilot if they got the right hit, if you weren't able to. So it's very difficult if someone is willing to commit suicide as part of a terrorist activity. It's difficult to stop. I mean, suicide bombers are, by definition, how do you stop someone that's already decided that they're willing to go
and of course, then what happens, I obviously, as a Democrat, sorry, almost Freudian slip there, as a Democrat, my concern would be, it's not, of course, we got to react, we got to respond, we cannot let this happen. We cannot let that group think that there are no repercussions for their actions. But when we swing the pendulum so far in one direction, like we did after 9/11, when you had the NSA with all their, incursions into our privacy. And by the way, this is not a Republican Democratic
it's not.
issue,
it really
because we've probably had more drone strikes under Obama than we ever had before, and likely, I think there have been, most Hispanics will tell you, there have been more people deported by the Obama administration than in previous administrations. So it's really about, I think, when we talk, it's the political response, but then what are the legal ramifications of it? Because what happens is when you have something like this happen, it's almost like the general public gives the politicians a blank check. Right, so go and do what you need to do.
There's a lot going on, and we didn't say this at the beginning, but anybody wants to chime in and not just listen to Gus and myself talk about this issue, because it's
absolutely.
I mean, it's really a hot button topic. You can call it 1-888-565-1470 and give us your viewpoints. And this is something that hits near and dear to everybody's heart.
Well, and I think it's something important that we have to talk about. It's we used to say, what is it? We were joking on the way in. It's religion, politics, and there's a third thing you don't talk about, a money or something like that at dinner table discussions, right? But we have to. I think this is one of those situations where it's not simply, the answer is not simply about nuking the heck out of people and sending them back to the Stone Age and all that stuff, because like we talked about earlier, a lot of these were homegrown terrorists, and so what do you do with that? I mean, how do you react? Right. How do you respond?
Right, and it's one of the things prior to the attack on Friday we were going to talk about, I think today, was, for example, the Starbucks issue and religious freedom and how people take it to the nth level. Yes. And there was recently a federal judge ruled a nativity scene in Arkansas couldn't stand in front of a courthouse, and so there's a lot of religious freedom issues going on in the country. But really, when you think of that issue, you can't think of it without talking about what's going on in the Middle East. And it's a completely different, because it's not religion there. It's people who take and they obfuscate religion, and they circumvent religion for their own causes. The Muslim religion is not a religion of terror. My dad, again, who's Egyptian, we have several friends who are Islamic, and they are very good people. It's people, and really every religion has it. I don't think
more than the KKK
right.
is,
I mean, every
is
religion
representative
has
of the Christians.
We all have our. I mean, think of Ireland. The Catholic Protestant wars had their own terrorism issues.
My wife's from Yugoslavia. And they have had histories. Of course, when we argue, I tell her, your people have been fighting for ages, for centuries. It's in your blood. It doesn't seem to go over very well.
Yeah, I don't think that. I can't imagine she reacts well to that.
I think, it's such a deep-rooted issue. And what's interesting is, if you think about it, what have we been talking about here in this show for the last, I don't know, it's been 4 or 5 months. It's been issues about religion, issues about sexual orientation, right? There have been issues about, civil rights, civil liberties, and how far does the interplay that go with the law? And here we have the extreme, right? But our concern, as any person who's a law-abiding citizen and certainly respects the rule of law, says, okay, but let's not write a blank check either. Because you remember when in World War II, when we had, a little known fact, but we had that the Japanese
deterrent camps. Absolutely. And that's what, one of the things from a legal perspective, what do you do? Do you profile at airports more? What are the legal ramifications of that? Because again, I mean, it's a very small percentage of the Islamic community, and it's not just the Islamic community. I mean, there are terrorists from every religion and every walk of life. But so legally, what do you do? Legally, what can you do?
Well, profiling is effective. That's the problem.
Right.
It's
typically not grandma.
It's discriminatory, but it is effective.
Did you see the video, though? I say that, but it wasn't a young lady that stabbed the Israeli guard at the Palestinian border. It's hot on YouTube now. She walks to a checkpoint in Israel out of Palestine and is digging through her purse, and he's looking for an ID. And next thing you know, she pulls out a knife and stabs the guy.
Really?
Yeah, and so it can be the most innocent of looking people, because at some point these terrorists... Well, that's who they
and speaking of Israel, you and I were talking about, because you mentioned what's the Israeli airline?
El Al.
Okay, and how it's never been.
It's amazing. If you think of the probably the number one airline that the terrorists would want to target would be Israeli airline El Al. Never had a terrorist incident on an El Al flight, but I've flown El Al, and I got to tell you, the security they make you go through, They do. They're not dentists, but they do cavity searches. Okay, I mean it's a different experience.
So you got the necessary exam a lot sooner than you should have.
Exactly. I didn't get it, but actually, one of the people, I was traveling with a group of kids. I mean, we were all.
Did your voice crack like that?
And one of the counselors, who was probably in his 20s, did have to go through that.
Right.
I mean, it's random, but it's not so random.
Then the issue becomes: do we want to live in that type of police security type of state? Because we have to balance our freedoms to be able to just express ourselves, our freedoms, our civil liberties, if you will. And also not just civil liberties, but look, just simply being able to live without having that presence.
Right. I mean, in this country, we have the debate over the Second Amendment and whether it gives people the right to bear arms, et cetera. But if you go into some
militia,
but if you go into some countries, Israel is an example. I mean, there's some countries in Latin America. You step off a bus, and there are people in street corners with Uzis or machine guns, whether it be police or security. Israel, they're all over the place, and you just get numb to it because you see it everywhere you go. And there are a lot of countries around the world that are like that as well. Colombia,
perfect example. I visited there a couple years ago. A friend of mine had got married there in Bogota, and that's the capital. And it was fine, but when we pull up our hotel, armed military, machine guns, dogs, the whole bit.
Do we want that here? I don't think anybody wants that here.
It's the balance, right? It's the balance of feeling secure.
That's why when Trump... I'll criticize my own party there, where Trump makes a statement like what happened in Paris wouldn't have happened if the Parisians were armed. Really? I mean, we're not going back to the Wild West in the 1800s where everybody carried guns and you just got into street fights that way.
Could be more dead if you think about it. Because who do you know is shooting at who, right? It's like a bar fight.
Right.
It's like a bar fight when someone throws the first punch and the other guy doesn't know who punched him, and you're just going to fight with everybody.
Exactly.
So you just have a mass killing because people are just going to be shooting each other, not knowing who the bad guy is. Right. I mean, it's absurd. We don't want that kind of state. And again, it's not more arms. It's not more bombs. It's not. I don't think that's the answer. I mean, we've tried that. Again, it's like the war on drugs. We've tried this way, and if you see now, there's been. Seemingly lately, particularly as to marijuana, for example, a more sensible approach in some places. Say, you know what? Let's take it away from the black market. Let's try to tax it. Let's try to get it under the curtain of the law.
And I'll say the same thing at some level with guns. It's interesting that you can take statistics and do whatever you want with it, but
80% of all statistics are wrong.
That's true.
I read that somewhere.
But if you take those cities and states that have the toughest gun laws, they also have some of the highest crime rates.
Right.
So I don't know what the right answer is there either.
Yeah, but then you use like a place like Canada or some other countries that have zero tolerance when it comes to guns, and their murder rates are really low.
Right. I think if you have an entire country
right.
with restrictive laws, then people don't have pockets to travel to. If you have it, that one of the things about the United States, which makes us unique, and it's both good and bad, is the states' rights issue. So when different states have different laws,
right,
people can travel to.
And here's what's interesting about
pockets.
it. It just occurred to me. I mean, we talk about the terrorists, and we talk about yes, 100 people, 130, I think, last count, which is awful. Which is the way it happened, I think, also. And look, they were actually fortunate because their target was a soccer game between Germany and France. And they were supposedly late, and so we were fortunate that there weren't more casualties. But what about our schools? I mean, all the kids going into schools and whether it's from Columbine to now, we've seen a rash of these types of events. It just takes one person, and they go in and the mass killings, mass shootings. This seems to be, it's not just simply a terrorist issue, an Islamic terrorist issue. That's more of an organized situation. We will also have these other issues here in the home front. So again, it's the balance between protecting ourselves, protecting our kids, and also balancing not to encroach too much on our civil rights and civil liberties. But again, we probably pose more. Well, not probably. We know we pose more questions than answers. But I think as citizens of this earth, and also as attorneys, we focus on not just the reaction, but also how is that going to affect the laws? How is that going to affect?
I'll say there's one difference between the Columbine example, I and some of the other examples is, and I think that this is where some of our politicians have to recognize the Middle Eastern, when terror is premised in religion, and I'm not suggesting that it is the religion that truly preaches it, but if someone is going to choose to use their religion as the reason for committing terror, you are never, and I will say that word a million times, never going to change that person. I would like to think for examples like Columbine, for examples like what happened in Connecticut, where we realize we don't do a really good job of treating mental illness in this country. And that's a whole separate, all the work I've done with autism, and we've talked about that on other shows. I don't think we really do a good job of treating some of our developmental disabilities and mental illness in this country.
Right.
And let me be clear, I'm not saying autism's not a mental illness. It falls under that umbrella. But it is a condition that is not well treated in this country in many instances because it's not funded properly. But those are things that you can treat and work with. But if we believe that we're actually going to be able to negotiate with these terrorists or work with them or get them to change, that is a mistaken belief.
Oh, I agree with you. Yeah. I'm not suggesting
I know you weren't,
the radical. I think the problem is it's the second level, the third level. These guys would be crazies. It's kind of like the Branch Davidians or the
Westboro Baptist Church. Was it Westboro? What's the church that pickets everybody? It's Westboro something, but
right, or even Charles Manson. There's always going to be extreme there. It's just the number of people that are going to follow him or them. And you're right. The extremists, forget it. You can't deal with them. It's the second layer, the third layer, the kids that are going from these countries that are, again, it's poverty, it's lack of opportunities. It's no different than a kid who joins a gang in some ways. I don't think they really believe that. They're just manipulated because they have no other alternative. They see this as some kind of warped brotherhood, right? When in reality, it's just these people. You notice it's never the leaders that are going on and wrapping themselves around with suicide bombs, right? They're always sending these kids, these younger people to go and promise them all these things. Those are the people that I think can be, in some ways, we have to try to address it. Have to try to address it from some perspective. I mean, it's a lot more questions than answers. But I think we have a few more minutes left. Yes, we have several. We have 5 minutes.
5 whole.
Perfect,
wow.
Perfect. So I know we have a couple of other things there. I don't know if there's anything you want to get to.
Not really. I mean, I thought it was interesting. There's a federal judge in Arkansas that has now ruled that a courthouse nativity scene has to come down because it violates the First Amendment. The courthouse shouldn't sponsor. I think at some point in this country we get a little bit too strict. I mean, I while that's probably technically, legally correct, I think I'm bothered more by the fact that people choose to bring those lawsuits. And maybe it's not a criticism of the judge. I mean, I think under the First Amendment, the judge probably had no choice.
Much of a choice.
But the fact that people feel it's the Starbucks cup. It's the fact that people in this country feel that they're so easily offended by someone else's religion. I think that if you believe that we are a tolerant country, which I believe we are, then tolerate it. I'm not offended. I'm Jewish. I'm not offended when I see a nativity scene. It's in a public place. If I assume that if I wanted to nearby the nativity scene, I could do it. Yeah, put a menorah there or whatever. And I don't think anybody would argue with it. I would be offended, for example, if a nativity scene were somewhere and there was enough room to put a menorah nearby and people told me I couldn't. That would be something different.
Look, I agree with you 100%, but like you said earlier, I think those are the laws, right? I mean, and so in order to, I think, ensure that there is a separation of church and state, we have to be willing to deal, live with these kind of minor inconveniences. That someone just says, you know what, because you don't want a judge carving out an exception in this situation. Because that creates a dangerous slippery slope. I don't know that I'm criticizing
the judge. I think I'm more criticizing the people that felt they needed to bring the lawsuit.
You have nothing better to do.
Right.
I mean, they're litigation trolls, basically.
Right, exactly. And then an interesting thing, we talk a lot about employment law because it's one of the areas Gus and I practice, is that the Obama administration is now backing an amendment to the Civil Rights Act to include sexual preference as one of the protected classes. And we've talked about Title VII and employment discrimination under the Civil Rights Act. Right now, sexual preference is not a protected class. So if you fire someone because of their sexual preference, that is not unlawful. And there's a movement now to get that changed. And I think it'll be interesting to follow that because it's about time that we start to, I mean, that law was passed in the 60s. I mean, things have changed. A few things have changed since the 60s. Gus wasn't even alive in the 60s.
You beat me to it. Well done. Well done.
I knew that was coming. But yeah, and so that's going to be interesting to follow.
Well, we have, look, we started a topic with law and politics, and I think all of this gets wrapped into that. I mean, we have obviously the Republican primaries and the Democratic primaries. And I think it shows a very interesting dichotomy, if you will, between the firmly entrenched views on both sides.
And we've invited each of the candidates to come on our show, and none have agreed. So I don't know, but
they have not taken
us up on our offer.
Well,
but
Trump will not talk to me because he said he would have sent me back 30 years ago.
Exactly, you'd be in Chile right now.
But I think that more than anything, we got our 2-minute warning here. But more than anything, it's we have to be mindful of what our leaders, what type of wars, what type of situations our leaders get into. I'm reminded where we are. I think I mentioned this before. The caricature that I saw, or cartoon that I saw when we were about to invade Iraq, had Bush in stirrups and a cowboy hat, and they had the Middle East as a hornet's nest, and he was there with a stick poking it. Which, unfortunately, that's what leaves us here. But anyways, we have a 1-minute takeaway.
So the 1-minute takeaway is not going to be to sum up the show, but when you said 2-minute warning, you reminded me that I have to make a shout.
Really?
I have to make a shout out to my Tar Heels, who beat the Miami Hurricanes 59-21 this weekend. And really, I don't think we're getting enough respect. I think the Tar Heels, after we beat Clemson, are going to be playing for a national championship.
Oh, bold words. I don't know. I have nothing to say.
Yeah, you have nothing to say.
I will give you that. And I think we have our hopefully our picture for the thought of the day, or the closing thought, which is, I think, apropos in light of the discussion we've had. This is from John Steinbeck, who said, "All war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal."
It's a great point. Absolutely.
So tune in again next week to Attorney Confidential with Gus and Neil.
Good evening, everybody.
You have been listening to Attorney Confidential with Gus Bravo and Neil Kotze, 2 rated AV trial attorneys with over 40 years of experience. Tune in next week for another episode of entertainment, insight, and just plain fun. That's Monday, 6 p.m. on WNN, 1470 AM. See you next Monday for more Attorney Confidential. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored